So here we have our cycle of fifths. It's a little bit more neat than the one I drew in the previous video, but essentially it's the same thing. All we're doing is starting on a C at the top of the circle here, where you might put 12 on a clock, and just jumping around in a clockwise direction through intervals of a perfect fifth. And we'll see that this is quite interesting, firstly because if we do that, we can jump through intervals of a perfect fifth and we never repeat a note, and eventually we go right the way around the circle and we end up back at C. So that in itself is rather interesting. But in this video I'm going to show you something else that's quite interesting about this arrangement of pitches that we get when we create a cycle of fifths. It's probably quite useful if you have a good understanding of the idea of what a key is and what a scale is, and also a good idea of perhaps what you might expect to find in a major scale on each of the 12 pitches. If you don't know that, that's fine, no problem. And in fact, this might be a really good way of establishing that, solidifying that in your mind. So let's think of C. Can you tell me, for example, what a C major scale looks like? Well, it kind of looks a bit like this. So essentially we've gone from C down here to C up here, and we've not used any black notes at all. And so when we create a piece based on this scale, you could say when we create a piece in the key of C major, then what essentially we're doing is drawing most of our notes, not exclusively, but most of our notes will probably come from this scale. And it's quite interesting to note, probably at this point, that that scale didn't contain any sharps or flats. So I'm just going to write a natural sign here and put that there to really represent this idea that the scale or key of C major, if you read music from music notation, you'll also know that the key signature for C has no sharps or flats. It's just would normally just be a treble clef or a bass clef, and then the music would start. So that's C. What about this G? What about the next step? So as we start to move around the circle in a clockwise direction, we'll start to see some interesting patterns. For example, if I play the major scale associated with G, let's have a look at that. That was essentially quite similar in terms of the pool of notes being used for the scale, but we did have one new note, and that was an F sharp. And so if I was going to write something on here to represent the scale or the key of G major, I'd probably say we could think of that scale as having one sharp. So I'm just going to write one sharp there. That's the kind of most interesting ingredient compared with the C major scale, which didn't have any sharps or flats at all. What about D major? Well, let's have a go at that. So the F sharp's still there, we had that in our G major scale, but here in our D major scale we also added in a C sharp, and so that scale of D major, or the key of D major, could probably be summarised by saying it has two sharps, an F sharp and a C sharp. So I suppose you can start to see this pattern emerging. So if you had to make a guess as to how many sharps we might expect to find in the scale or key of A major, what might you expect to find? Well, if the pattern's going to continue, it's probably going to be 3, and that is exactly what we get. We still have our C sharp, and we still have our F sharp. We also have a G sharp coming into the mixture. And so if you've got a good understanding of scales and keys and how those work, you'll know that it's quite useful to think of these different keys and scales in terms of how many sharps or flats they have. And so this is really starting to unlock the power of the cycle of fifths when we see that, in fact, the order of scales does follow this pattern. So every time we move one step around the scale, we'll find that we get one more sharp added to our key signature or our scale or our key. Now that is true for the first half of the scale. Let's just jump over a few. I have to just take it on my authority that you get 4 sharps in the key or scale of E and 5 sharps in the key or scale of B. Let's have a quick look at B. Exactly, so we've got C sharp, D sharp, F sharp, G sharp and A sharp. So in fact, all the possible sharps that we could have, we have in the scale of B major. Well, is it actually all the possible sharps? We'll see that's not actually all the possible sharps if we get as far as the next step, which is F sharp major. And you might be thinking, well, how on earth can we include another sharp when we've used all of the black keys? And that's a very, very good question, and it's really useful to cover this at this point. Let's have a look at the scale of F sharp major. What does that look like? Well, it has an F sharp in it because it's called F sharp major, and then it goes up through these different notes here. And just like all the other scales, we've noticed that the new sharp has been introduced right at the end of the scale. You remember the G major scale had its last sharp, its new sharp, added right at the end, and we get the same thing when we're in F sharp major. we get this note here. Now you might be saying, well, that is an F, so that's not really a sharp. But actually, it is a sharp because we don't call that note in this scale an F, because we need one of every single letter name to be in each scale. And the problem is that we've already used F by calling the scale F sharp. We've used F already, it's an F sharp. So what do we call that note so that we've got one of every note in the scale? Well, we actually call it an E sharp, so that we've got an F, a G, an A, a B, a C, a D, and an E. If we just said it was an F, we wouldn't have any kind of E in this scale. So that's how we manage, even though we've only got 5 black notes, to add another sharp to the scale or the key of F sharp major. Now moving on, there are obviously some scales here that use flats instead of sharps, and this is the kind of critical, pivotal point of the cycle of fifths. We get to the end here, and that's why we've got both names for F sharp written here. And it's not to say that you couldn't do the same thing for the other scales. For example, D flat is technically a C sharp, and so there is a scale called C sharp major. We don't use it very often, but the reason that we've got both of them here is this is kind of the point at which we transition through the scales or the keys that we generally tend to talk about as having sharps in, to the scales and keys that we generally talk about as having flats in. So let's have a quick look at G flat major. How many flats do we have there? Well, let's see if we can count them. So here's G flat. Obviously it has the same notes in as F sharp major because they're essentially the same scale. But when we talk about this scale as being a G flat major scale, let's see which flats we get. So it's now starting on a G flat, not an F sharp, and we're going to carry on up going through the notes of A flat, B flat, and we have something interesting here again. We have our B, but actually we're talking about this as a C flat, so that's another one. So we've got up to 4 so far: a D flat, an E flat, an F, and a G flat. And if that seems a little bit complicated, I think other places on the site have explained a little bit more about the different scales and how we build them. So just for the purposes of not letting this video take too long, we're just going to count those and agree that just the same way that F sharp major, this scale, this key, had 6 sharps, this one here, because it's the same scale, has 6 flats. So all we've done is we've shifted the naming convention of the different notes to be thought of in terms of flats instead of sharps. All the way through this first half of the circle, we've been thinking in terms of sharps, and now as we go back towards C, on this journey back towards C around the second half of the circle of fifths, we're going to think of our scales in terms of flats. So if everything's symmetrical, this is kind of the line of symmetry, if you like. We can draw a little line through the middle of our circle. And something kind of interesting here, because you'll notice that this was our middle sort of pivotal scale, which, you know, when you're thinking of it as an F sharp major scale, you're going to have 6 sharps, and when you're thinking of it in terms of a G flat major scale, you're going to have 6 flats. What do you reckon might happen when we look at this scale here of D flat major? If it's following the same pattern, it's basically in reverse as we go back around the circle to C. So let's have a quick look at D flat major and count the number of flats that we use on the way round. So let's have a go. There's a D flat, E flat, that's an F, that's not a flat, G flat, so that's 3 flats so far, A flat, B flat, C, and D. So it does follow this pattern. Here we have a scale or a key that normally, if we're playing in the key of D flat major, we could expect to use 5 flats. And the pattern continues round. A flat uses B flat, E flat, A flat, and D flat. E flat major scale or key uses 3 flats. That's B flat, E flat, and A flat. Looks like this. There's an E flat. There's our A flat, B flat, and that's all we use. Those are the only flats we use in that scale. So you see we've come round the circle again, and we're starting to use fewer flats, the same way as we went round the circle from C in the clockwise. In the first half, we're using more and more sharps. Now we're using fewer and fewer sharps each time, fewer and fewer flats, sorry, as we go round the circle. And so we get to B flat, and that gives us a scale with only 2 flats in. And this is just as useful if you play purely by ear and you pick out notes from scales and you build melodies and chords that way. It's really useful. This is also really useful to know if you read from notated music, because obviously all of these different signs here, the 2 flats, 3 flats, 4 flats, 2 sharps, 3 sharps, those are all the key signatures that you might find. So if you have this idea of the cycle of fifths in your mind, you can see, for example, a key signature with 3 sharps and instantly know, oh, that's A, because it's 3 steps round in the cycle of fifths. But to complete the circle, I must get to the end. We need a scale of F major, and it looks like this. So the only black note we used there was a B flat. And so amazingly, like through, it's almost like the forces of nature, our cycle of fifths has set out in front of us this really, really clear and quite pretty pattern, setting out all the different keys and scales for us, but not in terms of the way that we normally set out the piano, from notes going from low to high, but in a different way. So our piano keyboard is purely low notes on the left, those ones, and high notes on the right. But what's interesting about our cycle of fifths is that it's arranging the notes in a slightly different way. So as you go around the first half of a cycle of fifths, you're gaining sharps with each jump. So the key of C major has no sharps or flats at all. That's why we've written this natural sign. It doesn't have any sharps or flats involved. And then as we continue around the scale, G major has one sharp, D major has two, and we carry on round until we get to the top, the 6 o'clock on the clock face. And it's interesting that 6 o'clock has 6 sharps and 6 flats. And then as we go back round losing the flats. Each step around the scale we lose one flat from our key or from our scale, and then we end up back at C again. And so that's just another way to represent the 12 pitches, which perhaps says a little bit more, not just about how low or high they are, but how they're related in terms of the flats and sharps that we need to build both scales and keys on those 12 pitches.